By the time the cells fell quiet, the experiment had already succeeded in one sense. Order had been imposed. Violence had stopped. The noise, the movement, the unpredictability that once defined the prison were gone. What replaced them was something harder to measure and harder to reverse. Men were still alive inside those cells, but the institution itself was no longer sure what it had created. The place was USP Marion, a federal penitentiary in southern Illinois. And what happened there would permanently change how the United States punished its most difficult prisoners. At first, officials described it as control. Then as security. Later, as necessity. But inside Marion, something else was happening. The prison was quietly becoming the first true long-term solitary confinement experiment in modern American corrections. Not for days. Not for weeks. But for years. And almost no one outside was paying attention. That silence did not come from nowhere. It followed a breaking point. Before the lockdown, Marion had already earned a reputation within the federal system as unstable and violent. Tension between staff and inmates was constant. Segregation units existed, but they were temporary. Prisoners cycled in and out. The assumption was that isolation was a short-term corrective tool, not a permanent condition. Then that assumption collapsed. In a span of months, 2 federal correctional officers were killed inside the prison. The attacks were separate, but the message to the Bureau of Prisons was unmistakable. Marion was no longer under control. Whatever rules had governed daily life there had failed. What followed shocked even experienced administrators. Instead of targeting specific individuals, federal officials imposed a prison-wide lockdown. Every inmate. Every unit. Movement stopped. Programs ended. Recreation disappeared. Cells that had once been part of a rotating system became places of near-total isolation. And then the lockdown never lifted. At first, officials insisted it was temporary. A cooling-off period. A chance to stabilize the environment and protect staff. But weeks turned into months. Months stretched into years. Marion was no longer operating as a standard penitentiary. It was something else entirely. That raised a question no one could easily answer. What happens when isolation stops being a punishment and becomes the default condition of confinement? The men inside Marion began spending nearly all day alone. Meals were delivered through slots. Human contact was minimal and often conducted through steel doors. Windows, where they existed, faced concrete walls or narrow corridors. Sound traveled poorly. Time blurred. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that no one had designed Marion for this purpose. There were no long-term studies guiding policy. No medical framework for years of isolation. No psychological benchmarks. The prison was improvising in real time, and the inmates were the test subjects. Federal officials described the outcome as a success. Assaults dropped. Staff injuries declined. Order was restored. From an administrative standpoint, the numbers justified the approach. But inside the cells, the consequences were accumulating. Medical staff began reporting unusual patterns. Inmates complained of severe anxiety. Some experienced panic attacks. Others described memory problems, paranoia, or difficulty speaking after prolonged isolation. These reports were documented, but they did not trigger a reversal. Instead, they were treated as secondary concerns. Few people outside ever learned what happened next. Because Marion became a model. Within the Bureau of Prisons, administrators took notice. If near-total isolation could control Marion, could it work elsewhere? Could the same structure be applied to prisoners deemed violent, disruptive, or ideologically dangerous? Marion was no longer just a prison. It was proof of concept. That shift marked a turning point in American corrections. Before Marion, long-term solitary confinement existed, but it was fragmented and inconsistent. After Marion, it became standardized, replicable, defensible. And once an idea proves workable, it spreads. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, new facilities were being designed around the Marion model. Not as temporary lockdowns, but as permanent architecture. Single cells. Minimal movement. Strict control over sensory input. Human contact reduced to procedure. These were not accidents. They were intentional design choices rooted in what Marion had demonstrated. But even as the system expanded, questions persisted. Was order being achieved at the cost of long-term harm? And if so, who would be held responsible for the consequences years later? The Bureau of Prisons maintained that solitary confinement was a necessary tool. Officials argued that certain inmates posed risks that could not be managed through traditional means. Marion was cited as evidence that extreme measures prevented extreme outcomes. Critics saw something else. They pointed to lawsuits, medical reports, and testimony from former inmates. They argued that prolonged isolation altered behavior in ways that did not disappear upon release from segregation. That prisoners often emerged more unstable, not less. The data was incomplete. Long-term studies were scarce. What existed was fragmented across cases and facilities. That uncertainty did not slow expansion. As Marion's influence grew, it quietly lost its original identity. The prison that once housed a mix of federal offenders was now almost entirely dedicated to isolation. Normal programming never fully returned. The lockdown became permanent policy. And with permanence came normalization. By the time the federal supermax system formally expanded, the idea of housing inmates in near-continuous isolation no longer seemed radical. It had precedent. It had statistics. It had Marion. But something critical had been overlooked. Marion's experiment had never truly ended. It had simply been accepted. There was no official conclusion. No comprehensive review of long-term outcomes. No moment where officials publicly assessed whether the psychological costs outweighed the security benefits. The system moved on without closing the file. Inside Marion, inmates aged in place. Some entered the lockdown in their 20s and remained there into middle age. Appeals were filed. Legal challenges emerged. Courts reviewed conditions but often deferred to prison administrators on matters of security. Change, when it came, was incremental and slow. And still, the core question remained unresolved. Could a prison designed around isolation ever reintegrate the people inside it? Or was isolation itself reshaping the men it confined in ways the system could not undo? If stories like this matter to you, subscribe, because the next one goes even deeper. Over time, Marion's role diminished. Newer facilities took its place in the federal hierarchy. Purpose-built supermax prisons absorbed the most restrictive populations. Marion became quieter, less visible, almost forgotten. But its legacy did not fade. Every modern debate about solitary confinement traces back to Marion. Every legal argument about duration, mental health, and humane treatment echoes the decisions made there. Marion proved that long-term isolation could be implemented. What it did not prove was that it could be done without consequence. That unresolved tension still defines the American prison system. Today, when policymakers argue about limits on solitary confinement, they are arguing about Marion. When advocates cite decades of isolation as harmful, they are pointing to Marion. When administrators defend extreme measures as necessary, they are relying on Marion's example. The prison itself may no longer dominate headlines, but its impact is embedded in policy, architecture, and practice. The experiment worked in the narrowest sense. Violence was reduced. Control was maintained. Whether it worked in any other sense remains an open question. And that question, unanswered for decades, continues to shape the lives of thousands of people who will never see Marion, but live under the system it created. If this story kept you watching, the next one will stay with you even longer. Subscribe for more real prison documentaries.